This is the BBC.
This podcast is supported by advertising outside the UK.
BBC Sounds. Music, radio, podcasts.
Hello, I'm Sheila Dillon. This episode of the food programme is about a food museum. Have you thought very much about a food museum? I hadn't, really. But now Britain has one. England has one. As far as we know, it's the only one in the whole UK. What's it about? What could it be about? Could it join up the dots? Could it be part of the national conversation about food? Well, have a listen.
With some rolling pins.
We roll it out, and do we use lots of flour or do we not
use like a little bit.
Having a good time in a museum of food.
We've also
the remains of this, you've eaten it all.
We've eaten most of it, but...
This is the UK's first permanent food museum, somewhere that's casting light not just on the past, but on the now and the future. There's pleasure, insight, dots joined on food as the central connection that we all share. It's a living 84-acre demonstration in Stowmarket, Suffolk, of what's always been the DNA of the food programme. Food as the lens through which we can see and understand the world. The who, the what, the why. Jenny Cousins is the museum's director.
This is our Thrills and Grills programme. All morning the kids have been in the wall garden, harvesting food. They've been working with Chef Jake and his team, learning how to, cook it. And I think they're just waiting for it to come out of the bread oven now so that they can enjoy a lunch.
The Food Museum is a new name for the place that until last year was the Museum of East Anglian Life. In today's programme, we're going to see how Jenny and her team are reinterpreting its collections and expanding the programme to tell food stories.
We did a huge amount of visitor research about what it was that people expected to sort of find in a food museum. And obviously, unsurprisingly, one of the things that people expect is food that they can eat. We run, particularly during the summer holidays, a whole series of programmes like this one, which are aimed at getting people hands-on with food, getting them to learn about how food is grown, how it's made. And it sort of starts in the field with some growing wheat, and it goes through the kind of harvesting process because we've got all the historic equipment, and through the watermill, and then we come up here and we make a loaf of bread.
I mean, this is so much more than I'd expect, I think a lot of people would expect from a food museum. I mean, this is incredibly imaginative.
One of the things that we're really, really keen to interpret is processes. So it's not just sort of fixed historic objects, it's also techniques, traditions, food stories, memories, ideas about how food processing, food growing and eating should be. One of the things that we do with this programme is to get people sitting around a table and eating together, and I think that's as an important part of the tradition of food as is the growing or the making side.
What you're doing is in the midst of a culture which for centuries, at least since the Industrial Revolution, and then pretty seriously since World War II, have said food is trivial. You know, food doesn't matter. And it seems like what you're doing here is saying, yes, it does matter, and we're going to play a part in trying to get you to understand that.
I mean, absolutely. I think one of the things that came as a real surprise to me when we started thinking about how we could make this museum function differently was that it was amazing that there wasn't one already. I couldn't quite believe it. And sometimes we'd say it to people who, later became real advocates for what we were doing, but they wouldn't believe you. They'd go away, Google it, and they'd realise that, no, we don't have one. I mean, we've got great museums like pencils, pens, coffin works.
Steam engines, aeroplanes.
Lots of very material culture things. But maybe because food is sort of such a fundamental thing, I remain surprised that this doesn't already exist.
Scattered around the 84 acres are barns, farm buildings, that newly built bread oven, a watermill, wooded walks, a walled garden attached to the Jane Austenish 18th century gentleman's house at the centre of the small estate, and fruit trees.
We're standing in an orchard. It's a beautiful day. It's a vision of rural bliss. Jenny, tell us what the Food Museum is about.
I came here 7 years ago, and this museum actually started in 1967. It was formerly the Museum of East Anglian Life, and it kind of became clear to us over the years that the museum had been open, that the impetus that sort of set the museum up wasn't going to be the one that sustained it, and we needed to think about the collection and how we interpreted and told the stories here in a way that was relevant to people who are alive now, who don't have the same kind of first-hand memories that the museum was presenting of agricultural life and horse-drawn agriculture in this region. But we wanted something which kept the spirit of the original place, but built on that and engaged new audiences. And it just made a lot of sense to think of food as the topic which did that, because almost everything that was here did tell a food story. It just presented it in a sort of slightly different way. So what we've been doing over the past few years is reshaping the museum experience to focus on food and to engage people with where their food comes from.
And why do you think that matters?
I mean, it matters for all time, doesn't it? Because we all eat, we all need to consume our food several times a day, and where it comes from and who's made it and how you eat it really do matter and should matter to people. I mean, there's a lot of different kind of questions that you can ask yourself that relate to food choices, and I think we want to get people thinking about them.
Now we've walked through the orchard, we've seen the turkeys, we're going to go to the mill, which is just across the path in another field.
Yeah, so the museum collects buildings as well as sort of more conventional objects. So there are quite a few buildings here that have been moved and then re-erected on the museum site, of which these three buildings, the watermill, the mill cottage and the cart lodge, are some of them. Yeah, so on the museum site you can really see the whole story of bread. You can see wheat growing in the fields, you can go into the watermill and you can see it being ground into flour, and then you can follow it all the way up to the bread oven and make some bread and enjoy eating it.
I'm Lisa Harris, I'm a Collections and Interpretation Manager here at the Food Museum. This is Alton Watermill, which was moved here in the 1970s. We're going to open the sluice gate because the mill obviously wasn't built here originally. We have a little bit of museum magic because we have a pump to feed the pond. So mills like this would have been in every community, and it would have been quite common to see the farmer with his horse and cart heading down to the mill to get some grain ground. As many historic mills, we've installed a motor so that we can guarantee that we can grind, we can make flour, we can tell the story to our visitors.
Very powerful to see it, isn't it?
It's fantastic, isn't it? Yeah, I think it's the most wonderful part of this museum. I absolutely adore the mill.
Jenny, when the change came from the Museum of Rural East Anglia to a food museum, there was quite a lot of local opposition, wasn't there?
I think there are always people who, don't necessarily love change, but we did need more visitors, and I think it was really important that, people actually came to visit the museum to keep it going. So the success of the change we've made is borne out in increased visitor numbers. I mean, we're up at least 30% on what we were like pre-COVID. And I would say to people who are kind of concerned about, losing the East Anglian focus, it's still very much there. Like, it still underpins a lot of what we're trying to do, because food is often a very local story.
I was impressed by the labelling on the cage just behind us of the cage hens. You're telling a real story about, how we produce food, how we produce cheap food, but you're not banging someone over the head with it.
Yeah, I mean, I think show don't tell quite a lot of the time, isn't it? I think it is helpful for people to learn by experiencing things.
And these buildings, you seem to be using them to in a way, shine a light on issues about food and agriculture right now. Whereas this mill and these sheds around us could have been something much more reassuring in a way. Perhaps reassuring is not the word, but unchallenging, I suppose.
People come here for a good day out and they come here to learn. And those two things are not necessarily mutually exclusive. But I think one of the things we try to do is to challenge people to think differently about things, whether that's understanding the past differently or whether it's understanding the present differently because they're looking at things in the past and thinking about change. I think it's got a lot to tell us about who we are, and the more you look into the way that food has been grown, made, shared out, eaten, the more you kind of understand the present.
So if food has a lot to tell us about who we are, what would you put in a food museum to increase our understanding? Well, we asked some people in the food world, beginning with someone who loves a good food story.
My name is Ivan Day, and I'm a historian really of British and European food.
What did you think when the Museum of Rural Life transmogrified into a museum of food? What did you think?
I thought it was a really clever move because a lot of people are not interested in old ploughs, but everybody is interested in food. And though agriculture and horticulture are obviously the source of all this stuff, food is something much, much bigger than that. We've needed a museum of food in Britain for a very long time.
What would you want to put in this museum?
I collect objects, and the ones that really excite me are ones that tell a story. But when there's a human connection, then it really becomes very exciting. I've chosen 2 wooden moulds carved rather crudely with the royal arms, and they're for making gingerbread. They are carved also, and this is a really exciting thing, with the name of the baker, a man called John Scrimger. But it took me a long time to find out who he was. He's a Dundee baker who died in 1891, was very active in the city, had a great shop. He also used to victual ships that went out of Dundee Harbour. So he sold them ship's biscuit and lots of other things, including gingerbread, which was seen as a kind of treat for the sailors. Just after he died, 4 vessels went down to Antarctica from Dundee. They went on a whaling expedition, but they had some professional geographers on board, and they charted new parts of the Antarctic that no one had ever seen before. And they started renaming them. Like there's a Dundee Island in the middle of the Antarctic. It's still got that name. And one of the islands that had already been named Anderson Island, there was a cape covered with glaciers and snow, and the captain of the ship named it Cape Scrimger. So it's named after the Dundee gingerbread baker. If the name wasn't on them, I wouldn't have known anything about them. And it's rare that you get culinary objects that you can pin down to a particular person. So the Food Museum, at some point, they're welcome to these objects, as I think they tell a wonderful story.
What I'd like to see in the museum is a small-scale recreation of the Soviet-era bakery I visited just after the fall of the Iron Curtain with former food programme presenter Derek Cooper and baker Andrew Whitley, the founder, years later, of the UK's Real Bread campaign. It was in Kostroma, one of the golden ring of historic cities to the northeast of Moscow. There were pigeons flying in the rafters, but every day the bakery was turning out thousands of the most delicious sourdough rye loaves made from just flour, water, salt, and starter. I'd always been told it couldn't be done. You could not make top-quality bread on a mass scale, and I saw it wasn't true. Food programme presenter Leila Kazim has also been thinking about her contribution.
What would I have in the food museum? I think it would have to be something to do with fermentation, because it's such an ancient practice of preservation that I think every culture in the world does and has done. I would personally be so interested to see the journey of fermentation over millennia to understand how traditions vary across the world, because cultures use fermentation, even though they're fermenting quite different things, it's often for similar reasons, such as preservation, such as to process toxic elements in plants. So I would just find that fascinating. So my vote would be for a fermentation exhibition.
Back on my tour of the Food Museum, we'd reached the walled garden, the place where the children we met earlier had harvested their lunchtime veg to make chili, salsa and salad.
Hello, I'm Michael Stamper. I'm the Food Museum's food growing officer.
That's the biggest chard I ever saw.
Yeah, we've got some lovely Swiss chard growing this year, and beetroot. And
about 3 foot tall, right?
Yeah. But yeah, it's just a really nice space to learn about growing and how you can plant a seed and then harvest it and how to cook it. They can see where their food is coming from and get a better connection to their food.
I'm Jake. I'm a chef, mainly working in the field of school food and working with young people, trying to increase access to good, real cooking from a young, early age. This project that we've been running for 3 years is absolutely amazing. This morning we picked a lot of the veggies that gone into the vegetarian chilli we've been cooking. We go through basic cookery techniques and then we get to cook on our amazing wood-fired oven.
Well, what did your friends and family say when you said you were going to work in a food museum?
I think that they thought that it was probably quite a good fit. I mean, the thing that's really nice here is that it's obviously got the kitchen garden, which, especially this year, we've been using so much the produce from, which is absolutely beautiful. We'll do pickle making. Tomorrow they're going to be doing a ketchup. We do things like butter making or cheese making. We prioritise children on free school meals from the local area, but it is a paid option as well. It's 7 to 12-year-olds, so I think it's quite a key age pre-secondary school. So it's quite a kind of exciting time for them. I think hopefully they'll go into secondary school age feeling quite confident about food and trying new things.
Should we go in?
Yeah, please.
What do you think of your lunch?
I think it's very good. This is literally the best food ever.
And we've got some pretty clear plates, haven't we?
And strawberries for dessert.
You know, I went off to university and then I've just sort of always kind of come back to food as something that's so exciting, so creative, so hands-on. And the sort of work I do with kids now is just to try and foster that excitement and interest. There's not a huge amount in the curriculum about it. And I think having a society which is understanding about food, understand where food comes from, and you know how to shop affordably is more and more important in the times that we're living in at the moment. And it's such a fun and creative pursuit. Going out to a field or into a garden and picking vegetables and learning how to cook, it provides us with great employment opportunities. And I think if we can keep pushing towards that, then you know we're going to have a far more food secure future for lots of young people.
Chef Jake Barwood. Let's pause the tour for some more suggestions for the Food Museum. Here's food programme presenter Dan Saladino.
The item I'd love to add to the museum's collection is around 2 centimetres long, 5 millimetres wide, 5,000 years old, and is, or should I say it became, one of the world's most important sources of food. It's an ancient piece of maize, discovered by archaeologists in Puebla, central Mexico, in the 1960s. The tiny preserved cob shows the globally important grain around the midpoint of its 9,000-year-long domestication process. The specific cob I have in mind, smaller than a tube of lipstick and with only 8 rows of kernels, is one of the oldest ancient maize specimens so far discovered. So why feature it in a museum? Well, for me, it's evidence of the ingenuity of our species, Homo sapiens. Over thousands of years, generations of hunter-gatherers and then farmers interacted with an unpromising-looking wild plant, slowly shaped and modified it in order to produce more and more food and survive. Over millennia, humans dispersed this plant to every corner of the world, and in so doing, in good ways and some bad, they changed the world.
Delia Smith's suggestion is a piece of kitchen equipment that's no longer made, but I think is essential to enjoying a seasonal and particularly delicious British vegetable.
It's going to be one piece of cooking equipment because it's now August and I'm surrounded by runner beans and it's one of my favourite vegetables. I have a 50-year-old bean slicer. It was made by a company called Spong. But the thing about runner beans is that if you don't slice them thinly, then you have to have them in the water too long or in the steamer too long to cook them, and then they go a bit grey. But if you have a proper bean slicer and you slice it finely, then the cooking is minimum. They stay beautifully green and they taste amazingly wonderful. Just recently, we had a bit of a problem with ours. It was a wedding present when I got married 52 years ago, and we couldn't get the handle off. So I went online, managed to find an old second-hand one. So I've now got a spare. I can't live without it. Yeah,
It's a great addition to the museum, Delia. Thank you very, very much. Delia Smith on her precious vintage runner bean slicer. The next leg of the tour took us to 2 cottages outside the gates of the big house.
Yeah, so we've walked just down the path from Abbots Hall to what is basically the edge of the marketplace in the town of Stowmarket, so you can sort of see the church spire really clearly, and we're stood outside a very classic Suffolk pink cottage, which we know as Crow Street or the Dairy Cottages.
This pair of 17th century workers' cottages are gems and still contain much of the equipment used every day by their last resident, Emily Wilding, who ran the farm dairy until 1947, making butter and cream in one of the whitewashed, flagstone-floored rooms. Here she is, after her retirement, talking about her work.
I sold the milk at the door. I made butter. Did all the washing up, served the cream, fleeted the milk at the evening's milk. I fleeted next morning.
A snapshot of life frozen in time, her skimming bowl, butter churns, moulds, and wooden butter pats.
Look at this dairy, wow.
When she left in about 1975, she left the contents of the house largely to the museum. And I think, that does make it very real for people. It's very relatable.
Jenny, I mean, before we turned on the microphone, you were saying that it's easy to document the food of the gentry because they had cooks and they had books and they were recorded. It's very difficult to find evidence for what working class people ate.
Yeah, I mean, I think that's often true, that it's much easier to present an exhibition which does sort of deal with feasting rather than like what the everyday experience is like. But there's no evidence, and I think it's something that we're sort of increasingly looking to present in the way that we try and deal with food history at the museum.
A lot of working class families had handwritten notebooks, but the ones I've seen, and certainly the one my grandmother made, it's almost always cakes and puddings.
Yeah, I mean, it's interesting, isn't it? But I think the human imagination, perhaps we can only cope with so many core staple dishes anyway, so I'm sure we all return over and over again to some things that you just find yourself doing, and we're increasingly trying to do more and more collecting from people like that. We did a kind of thing that was partly around dialect, so people's food words and agricultural words, but also their memories, their recipes handed down. Everybody has their own kind of food family traditions, something that, reminds them of home or growing up. Like for me, it's called Gertrude Goslin's beef and pickle walnut stew. And food is like language, isn't it? I mean, it's something which is evolving all the time. Like what we ate in the 1970s is no longer what we eat now. We've just recently pulled into the museum collection a series of cordon bleu cookery courses that were published from 1960 to about 1975. And the way that food is presented in them, you just wouldn't do it like that now. It sort of immediately is dated. But that's within our own lifetime. And I think those sort of food fashions and the way that we absorb them, even without thinking about them, it's an evolving thing.
Well, what other subjects would be ripe for exploration through the lens of food? Here's brewer and food programme presenter Jago Wise.
The ingredient that I'd put in the food museum is sugar, mostly due to a book I read by James Walvin, How Sugar Corrupted the World, From Slavery to Obesity. Sugar is one of those ingredients where it is so ubiquitous. It's in every household. And when you look back at the history of sugar, and you look back at its links to slavery, and you look back at the links to human turmoil, trying to produce sugar, and you have the other side of the world who are consuming sugar as literal delicacies in sweets and cakes. So there's this juxtaposition in the history, and when you follow that through to modern day, you see the effect sugar has on young people, you see the effect it has on obesity numbers in the UK, and you look at the future of sweeteners generally, and we've seen the sugar tax. So looking how sugar develops societally, I think will be an interesting one.
I'm Ralph Earley. I retired formally. I spent 25 years in academia teaching food science. Before that, I spent 20 years in the food industry working in production, product development and quality management. So in a museum, I'd like to communicate how advertising and marketing influence our food choices, going back, say, for almost the last 200 years, and how that marketing has changed over time, how food labelling has changed. Historically, there were all sorts of adverts put out for food products which by modern standards would be considered to be unethical. But now we have regulations, but there are still issues. So I think a museum exhibit that showed marketing through the ages, but also showed the tricks and techniques that are used to persuade people to buy food products. And therefore that links into things like healthy eating. The industry is very, very sophisticated. The money they spend on advertising is phenomenal. If I were working in an advertising agency, I would, in a sense, see the consumer out there as my prey. Let's face it, a lot of adverts do either stimulate wants and desires, or they stimulate fears.
Ralph Early and Jager Wise on what they'd like to see in the food museum.
Jenny, food, has become somewhat contentious now. The whole meat debate, ultra-processed food. How do you begin to reflect that in a museum?
I think it's a hugely, hugely complex subject. We're certainly trying to explore the social, the environmental, the technological, the health aspects of food. I think that the only way we can really do that is to take a much more selective approach, bringing one issue to the forefront, then bringing another issue to the forefront, and that provides change in the museum context, makes it more interesting for visitors as well. For example, the exhibition that you'll see, Meet the Future, is very much interpreting one of those issues.
Just come in a very modern barn with Laura Kloss.
So as you move through the exhibition, you kind of explore different ways that the meat industry is impacting the environment. There's sections that compare which countries and how much they're eating in terms of their meat, the water that it uses, the feed that it grows to feed its animals, the impact on the rainforest and nature. And then other things that people have been trying to do to minimise that impact as well, eco-labelling and how we can become more conscious as consumers.
We interviewed quite a lot of people about regenerative agriculture and their perspective on meat consumption and how they, as farmers, related to this issue of the climate. There's a lot of oral history recordings of that. And we also cover the growing insect protein industry because it's a question that a lot of visitors ask us about.
I love the idea that you have a kitchen and then you have this tasting bar.
That's exactly. Would you like to try a biscuit with cricket flour in it?
Sure, yes.
And we do have actual crickets to try as well if people want to.
That's brilliant because you can throw facts at people and show them pictures, but this kind of tasting, this kind of food changes their mind. In a way, this food museum is, it's a bit like the food program where you recognizing that food is a pleasure, and as you said before, every day we eat 2 or 3 times. And yet it has a huge political and social and economic dimension. In your own mind when you took this job, how did you think you were going to put this stuff together?
I think it's really important to represent a very wide range of perspectives because obviously we all think about this differently. Some people passionately care, some people don't think about it at all. Obviously we're trying to get people to think about it a bit, but we're not necessarily trying to tell them what to think. So personally, I find this absolutely fascinating because it just deals with such a range of issues which are just fundamental to life. And yes, I don't see how anyone could fail to be interested in it.
Well, that's the attitude that would make a great museum. As we sat in the sunshine, enjoying an exceptionally good slice of courgette sponge cake, the veg grown in the garden and the cake baked by Chef Jake, I asked Jenny about her hopes and plans for the future of the museum.
We have a 10-year master plan for the museum. We are delivering against it bit by bit. We have some really quite exciting ideas about experiences that you might have in the long run.
Jenny, what do you hope people take away from a day here?
I hope, number one, that they have a good time and that they enjoy themselves. And I hope that they go away and reflect a bit on their own food choices and their own relationship with food and to think just a bit more about the issues and how, our relationship with food is continually evolving.